Across the quiet snowfields of Redfield, Montana, the winter sun rose slowly, casting golden light over pine trees dusted in white. The world looked peaceful from a distance, still, serene, untouched. But in the shadow of a weathered wooden fence, something moved. Not a deer, not the wind, but a dog. Barely alive, fur matted with ice. Eyes fixed on a back door that hadn't opened in 6 months. She was waiting, not for food, not even for warmth. She was waiting for her. Because sometimes a single act of loyalty outlives the very idea of hope. And sometimes, opening a door means opening a soul that's forgotten how to heal. Before we begin, do you have a dog of your own? Drop your answer in the comments. I'd love to know who's watching alongside their furry best friend. And if you believe that every animal deserves a loving home, not loneliness, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see the world. Redfield, Montana sat beneath a soft layer of midwinter snow, the kind that blanketed the rooftops like forgotten promises. The sky was a pewter gray, low with clouds that hadn't yet decided if they would bring more snow or just keep the silence company. The town was quiet this time of year, holiday lights long dimmed, sidewalks crusted with ice, and chimney smoke curling like ghosts above rooftops that held more memories than people now. Grace Miller stepped off the regional shuttle bus with nothing but a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a scar under her collarbone that no one could see. She was 34, lean but strong, her posture still disciplined from her years on the force. Her dark brown hair, once kept tight in a regulation bun, now spilled loosely beneath a wool cap. Her gray eyes, always sharp, now carried something heavier, something carved by too many nights staring at hospital ceilings. 6 months. That was how long it had been since the incident. 6 months in the trauma recovery unit of the regional center in Helena. 6 months since the hostage standoff, where Grace had lost more than just her badge and service weapon. She had walked into that bank alone. She had walked out, but part of her hadn't followed. She had filed the papers. Administrative leave for psychological recovery. Doctors called it PTSD. She called it silence. Now she was back, not because she was healed, but because she couldn't stay away from the one thread left tying her to the world, her house. It wasn't much. A small, single-level wooden home set on the edge of Redfield, a few miles past the last gas station and across from the frozen riverbank. She had bought it 5 years ago when she transferred from Portland PD, wanting something quieter after years on urban patrol. Back then, it had flower beds and an herb box on the windowsill. Now, as she rounded the final bend and saw it, she stopped walking. The paint had peeled in long, curling strips. The porch light was dark. The small wind chime by the front door hung crooked, tangled by storms. Snow draped the steps like untouched linen, and footprints, any footprints, were long vanished. Grace hesitated. Her gloved fingers reached for the keys she hadn't touched in half a year. Inside, the air was colder than outside. Her boots creaked on the wooden floors, and the living room lay frozen in time. A single chair, a small table, a framed photo of her, and a golden-furred pup from years ago. Ember. The name rang in her chest like church bells. Her breath caught, not from memory, but from what she didn't see. No bowl, no leash. No signs of the dog she had left behind in the care of a neighbor before checking into the facility. Her heartbeat quickened. She crossed the house, throwing open doors to the bedroom, the kitchen, the hallway. Nothing. No trace. The back door stuck when she tried to open it. Ice had sealed it like a coffin lid. She pushed harder, shoulder against wood, until it gave way with a groan that seemed too loud. The backyard, once neatly fenced and full of late summer sunflowers, was now a barren patch of snow-drowned neglect. The kennel structure she had built herself with Ember, watching every hammer stroke, was partially collapsed under the weight of snow. And then she heard it. A sound so soft it could have been a breeze. But no, there it was again. A whimper, ragged, weak, almost embarrassed. Grace stumbled forward, boots crunching through drifts. Ember? Her voice cracked. Kneeling beside the kennel, she reached for her phone's flashlight. The beam landed on a patch of fur, matted with ice, curled tightly in the far corner like a child trying to disappear. Ember was there, just barely. The dog was a golden retriever, 6 years old, but the shimmer of her once vibrant coat had dulled to a brittle beige. Her frame, once athletic and joyful, had collapsed, inward ribs visible, tail unmoving. Her left hind leg was stiff, twisted at an odd angle. Her eyes fluttered at the sound of Grace's voice but didn't focus. She didn't bark. She didn't move. Grace knelt into the snow. "Oh, God! Ember!" she whispered. Her hands shook as she reached into the collapsed kennel, touching cold fur that felt more like parchment than life. Ember whimpered again, barely. Grace gathered the trembling body into her arms, the dog as light as a blanket, as still as memory. She ran, down the hill, across the frozen street, through slush and gravel, until she burst through the swinging door of Redfield Veterinary Clinic, half screaming for help. Behind the front desk sat Dr. Callum Hart, a man in his late 40s with thinning blonde hair, wire-framed glasses, and a quiet steadiness. He took one look at the bundle in her arms and motioned her through the side door. "We don't have time for paperwork. Let's get her on the table," he said calmly, though his eyes betrayed urgency. "She's my dog," Grace panted. "I left her with someone. He must have... God, I didn't know." Dr. Hart nodded once, and Grace let go. She stood in the corner, fists clenched at her sides, trying not to collapse as the vet and his assistant moved swiftly, attaching IVs, checking vitals, whispering terms she barely registered: malnourished, severe dehydration, hypothermia, necrosis risk. "She might not last the night," Dr. Hart said quietly, "but we'll do everything." "I'll pay," Grace said hoarsely. "Whatever it takes." "You sure?" She pulled her badge from her bag, not to show rank, but to remind herself she used to stand for something. "Yes." As they worked, she stared through the glass, watching the dog she had raised, the dog who had curled beside her after every bad shift, now laying on a metal table between life and death. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Redfield, a boy named Luke sat in his grandmother's kitchen. 9 years old, small for his age, with sandy brown hair and freckles across his nose, Luke spent most days drawing. He didn't talk much to other kids, not since his parents' accident. But tonight, under the amber glow of the kitchen light, he sketched something new. A golden dog standing alone in the snow, looking at a house whose door was finally opening. He didn't know why he drew it. It had come to him in a dream. Outside, the snow began to fall again. The fluorescent lights above the treatment room flickered faintly, casting a sterile glow across the silver table where Ember lay motionless. Her body, once vibrant and full of movement, now barely rose and fell with each labored breath. Grace stood pressed against the far wall, arms crossed tight against her chest, her eyes fixed on the scene before her, as if daring the universe to take one more thing from her. She was still wearing the same black coat she'd worn from Helena, dusted now with patches of melting snow, sleeves damp from the rush through town. Her breath came out in uneven rhythms, not from exertion, but from the helplessness clawing its way up her throat. Dr. Callum Hart moved with practiced urgency. He wasn't a large man average height, a bit wiry, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been through enough late-night emergencies to no longer flinch. His assistant, a young woman named Maddie Torres, stood on the opposite side of the table, gently holding Ember's paw as the IV line was secured. Maddie was in her early 20s, with curly auburn hair tied into a frizzy bun, freckles dusting her cheeks, and a name tag pinned awkwardly to her floral scrubs. She didn't say much, but her brow furrowed deeply as she worked, fiercely focused, even though her lower lip trembled when she thought Grace wasn't looking. "She's hypothermic, dehydrated, and showing signs of muscle wasting," Dr. Hart said softly, his voice even, but edged with gravity. "There's swelling in the back leg, likely a fracture. We'll need to stabilize her now, or we lose her before dawn." Grace barely nodded. Her voice was a rasp. "Do whatever it takes." Hart glanced at her, his expression unreadable for a beat. "Grace, this won't be cheap. We'll need imaging, fluids, antibiotics, possibly surgery if infections set in." "I don't care," she snapped, too fast, too sharp, then softened. "Please, I'll cover it, all of it." From her coat pocket, she pulled a card and handed it to Maddie. "It's linked to my savings. Should be enough." Maddie nodded without a word and left the room to process it. Grace turned back to Ember and whispered, more to herself than the dog, "You held on? I won't let go now." Down the block, the bell above May's Flower and Supply jingled softly as a customer exited, their boots crunching on the salted sidewalk. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of pine, lavender, and old wood. May Taylor, a woman in her early 70s, moved quietly between shelves of dried bouquets and jars of potpourri. She was tall for her age, with long silver hair tied into a braid down her back, and a dignified way of walking like someone who'd seen many winters but still knew how to hold her chin high. Her hands, though weathered, were graceful and precise, accustomed to handling fragile things. She was adjusting the price tags on a row of white lilies when she caught a glimpse of someone through the frost-lined front window. A woman, tall, dark-haired, running past with something wrapped in a coat. At first May thought little of it, but then she saw the unmistakable limp, golden tail, half dragging in the snow. May froze. Memories rose like fog, a rainy afternoon 3 years ago. Her grandson Luke Small, bloodied from a bicycle crash, his foot pinned beneath a fallen mailbox post. The paramedics hadn't arrived yet, but someone had, a female officer, quick, calm, firm, Grace Miller. She had lifted the metal, freed the child, applied pressure to his bleeding leg with her own scarf until help came. May never forgot her name. She watched through the window as Grace disappeared through the doors of the veterinary clinic 2 shops down. Her fingers tightened around the bouquet in her hand. Without a word, she walked to the register, opened the drawer, and took out an envelope. She counted quietly, bills smoothed with care, and slipped them inside. That evening, as the clinic buzzed under dimmed lights, Dr. Hart returned to Grace with an update. "We've stabilized her, fluids are in, she's warm now, and the leg splinted. We're not out of danger, but she's fighting." Grace nodded, lips pressed into a thin line, trying to hold steady. "Can I stay?" "She's sedated. Won't know, but yes, we've got a cot in the back if you need." Instead, Grace pulled a chair beside the kennel where Ember now lay resting. Her breathing was shallow, but steadier than before. The shave patch on her side showed raw, red skin beneath the matted fur, now cleaned. An IV line threaded up into a fluid bag above her head, slowly dripping life back into her veins. Grace removed her coat, her fingers brushing against the old scars on her shoulder and forearm reminders of another kind of violence. Sitting there in silence, she reached into her duffel bag, pulled out a small velvet pouch, and removed a round silver medallion, Ember's old ID tag. She had kept it with her during therapy, a tether to something real. She placed it beside the metal cage, letting it rest where Ember could smell it. In the waiting room, Maddie reappeared holding the payment receipt, a look of confusion crossing her face. "Dr. Hart," she whispered. "The charge was partially covered. An anonymous envelope came in. Cash. Exact amount for the meds and fluids." He raised a brow. "Who brought it?" She wouldn't say, just left it with the receptionist and walked off. Said, "Tell her it's from someone who remembers the scarf." Hart glanced toward the back room, then nodded slowly. Let her have that moment. Back at the flower shop, May placed the empty envelope into the fireplace behind the counter. The flames caught quickly, curling paper into smoke. She watched it rise, eyes soft but dry. "Some debts," she murmured to herself, "are better paid in quiet." The sun returned slowly to Redfield, not with warmth, but with light thin winter rays slipping through gray clouds, casting silver across rooftops and thawing the edges of ice from wooden fences. Snow no longer fell, but it lingered like a breath held too long. At the small house just outside the center of town, steam curled from the chimney for the first time in half a year. Inside, the smell of simmering broth drifted into the hallway, carried by a soft melody playing from a battered radio set on the kitchen counter. Grace Miller stood barefoot on the wooden floor, sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot filled with beef, chopped carrots, and wild rice. Her movements were slow, deliberate, not just cooking, but anchoring herself. She had returned to this house with nothing but guilt and a dying dog. Now, Ember lay on a folded quilt in the living room, near the heat vent, wrapped in a thermal blanket with an IV drip still loosely attached. Grace had brought her home the night before, after the vet declared her stable enough for supervised recovery. Ember could not walk, barely lifted her head, but her eyes now followed Grace's every movement. In those eyes was a flicker of something that hadn't been there before, recognition. Grace had cleaned the house in stages, not like a chore, but like a ritual. Dust wiped from picture frames, Windows opened to let in light and birdsong, floors swept of silence. She had placed Ember's old toy, a frayed rope with one knot still intact. By her side, there was no need for commands now. Ember didn't need to fetch or heal. She just needed to be. The guest bedroom had been cleared and turned into a makeshift care space. Thick blankets layered on the floor, a water bowl changed every few hours, a notebook beside Grace's bed with scribbles of Ember's food intake, medications, and temperature readings. Grace hadn't realized how much structure her soul still craved. Police work had always run on routine. Now, so did healing. Each morning began the same. Grace would stretch beside Ember on the living room floor, not as exercise, but as presence. She played soft music, mostly classical, sometimes old jazz, and let the notes fill the quiet spaces between them. At noon, she massaged Ember's back legs with warm cloths, coaxing circulation into muscles that had almost forgotten their purpose. When Ember trembled, Grace opened the blinds and let the sunlight spill across the dog's golden fur like balm. Each day she tried not to cry. Some days she failed. A week passed, and Ember began to sit up with assistance. The first time she moved her front paws to reposition herself, Grace clapped aloud in delight. "That's my girl," she whispered. "You still remember how." Outside, life stirred differently. Luke Taylor, the boy with sandy hair and a worn green coat, had started walking past Grace's house every day after school. He didn't approach the gate, just paused by the fence, sketchpad tucked under one arm, and stood still, peeking between the wooden slats. From that distance, he could see the shape of the dog curled near the porch, and the tall woman, who now seemed to always be nearby, speaking softly or reading aloud from a book. There was something hauntingly familiar in the dog's posture, something from his dreams. Luke had always been different, quiet, inward, watchful. Since his parents' accident, he lived with his grandmother May above the flower shop. He didn't talk much to kids at school, but he drew, always drew. And lately, his sketches were filled with the same golden dog over and over in the snow, looking at a house, sometimes beside a figure that looked vaguely like himself. One afternoon, as Grace sat on the porch with Ember tucked in a blanket beside her, Luke stood frozen outside the fence, clutching his sketch pad. The sky was pale blue, the snow glowing faintly under the soft light of a sun that didn't warm. Grace saw the boy. She didn't speak, only offered a slight nod. Luke returned it, unsure why, and moved on. Grace watched him go. She remembered his face now, 3 years ago. The bike accident, the mailbox collapse, the scarf she used to stop the bleeding. He'd been so small then, so frightened. And yet, even now, something in his eyes remained the same, like he carried silence the way Ember did. Not with sadness, but with stillness. That evening, Grace stood at the kitchen counter, slicing sweet potatoes and humming low under her breath. Her bottle of sleeping pills sat unopened on the top shelf. She hadn't touched them in days. Sleep still came in fits, but when she woke sweating or shaken, there was always the soft sound of Ember breathing beside her to hold on to. Outside the window, just past the fence, Luke sat on the curb, drawing. This time, the dog in his sketch wasn't lying in the snow. It was sitting head lifted, ears perked, eyes alert. In the picture, the woman sat beside it, one hand resting lightly on its back. The snow in the drawing had started to melt. The wind howled gently across Redfield that night, brushing bare tree branches against frosted windows like fingers scratching for attention. It was the kind of cold that crept under doors and settled in the bones, the kind of quiet that didn't soothe, but watched. Inside the little house at the edge of town, the fire in the hearth crackled low, casting long shadows across the floor, where Ember slept curled on her quilt. Grace sat nearby on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, her eyes locked on the flickering flames, but not seeing them. She'd thought the worst was over. That being back home, surrounded by warmth, with Ember beside her, and days built from soft habits and slow recovery, would be enough to keep the nightmares at bay. But trauma doesn't check the locks when it wants to come in. It waits until the body is still, until the room is dark, until the heartbeat dares to slow. Then it strikes like memory wrapped in smoke. The nightmare came sudden and vivid, the screaming hostage, the flash of a weapon. The wrong door kicked open. Grace bolted upright on the couch, gasping for air. Her chest clenched, vision swimming in half-dream. Her body trembled uncontrollably as her hands clawed at her neck, searching for oxygen that wasn't missing. Her breaths came sharp and shallow, each one echoing inside her like a gunshot ricochet. Her eyes darted toward the door, just to check it was still closed, still locked, still real. And then came a sound, a faint rustling, not in the wind, from the floor. Ember. The golden retriever moved slowly, every step a strain, her legs still unsure, but her will steady. She dragged herself off the quilt, paws scraping softly against the wood. Her body swayed with effort, but she reached the couch, reached Grace, and without ceremony she pressed her head against Grace's knee, then nudged gently up into her chest. Grace froze. The weight of that gesture, small and wordless, broke something inside her. Tears came suddenly, not with hysteria, but as a flood long held back. She wrapped her arms around Ember, burying her face in the dog's soft fur. And for the first time in months, she wept. Not from fear, not from rage, but from release. Ember stayed pressed to her, tail thumping faintly against the couch cushion, her body shaking as much as Grace's, but for an entirely different reason. She didn't try to fix Grace. She didn't try to change anything. She just stayed, and that was enough. "Thank you," Grace whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Outside, the moon rose fully over Redfield. Snow glimmered along the rooftops and fences, and silence returned to the house. Not the same suffocating silence of the weeks before, but something more sacred now, something shared. Across town, in a warm corner of May's Flower and Supply, a different kind of story was unfolding. Luke had spent all afternoon at the work table in the back of the shop, his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth as he shaded carefully along the edge of a large sheet of white drawing paper. His fingers were smudged with charcoal, and his brows knitted in concentration. The picture had started in a dream, but now it was becoming real, at least on paper. The drawing showed a single golden dog, seated on snow under a full moon. No other figure was in the scene, just the dog, looking upward toward the sky with an expression that somehow mixed longing and serenity. Behind the dog was a faint silhouette of a house with light spilling through one open door. May, watching from behind the register, approached quietly. "That's beautiful, Luke," she said gently, adjusting her knit cardigan over her shoulders. "Who is she?" Luke blinked and looked up. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "I don't know her name, but I think she's waiting for someone." May studied the picture for a long moment, then she nodded. "Sometimes we all are." She hung the drawing in the front window of the shop that night, just as the last customers were leaving. Beneath the warm lights, against the cold glass, it stood out like a beacon. The next morning, townsfolk paused as they passed. No one said much, but several turned around and came in to ask about the artist, about the dog, about the quiet ache they felt but couldn't explain. Back at the house, morning came slowly. Grace sat on the porch, a mug of coffee in hand, Ember lying beside her, with her head resting on Grace's foot. Her breathing had steadied again, soft and rhythmic, like the whisper of leaves. The night had passed, and this time she had not faced it alone. Morning came to Redfield in a hush, with pale sunlight filtering through snow-laced clouds and the sharp scent of pine carried on the breeze. The streets remained dusted in white, but a path had begun to appear, pressed faintly into the snow between Grace Miller's front porch and the edge of the town square. Every day now, Grace and Ember walked that trail together, side by side. Grace had resumed her morning routine not out of habit, but out of hope. Wrapped in a long gray coat and knitted scarf, her posture more upright than in months, she took slow steps alongside Ember, who still walked with a limp but moved with newfound purpose. Ember had gained back some weight, her golden coat now brushed and gleaming faintly in the light. The IV port was gone, and though the scar on her hind leg remained, she walked steadily, ears flicking at every sound, head held high. She didn't need a leash. She never strayed. Her place was beside Grace always. On this particular morning, they passed the Redfield Elementary playground just as recess was letting out. Laughter rang across the frozen yard, high-pitched and wild, the kind of joy only children in mittens could produce. Grace stopped to watch, sipping coffee from a thermos. Ember sat beside her, tail curled around her paws. She stared not at the children, but at one in particular, Luke. He wore a blue jacket too large for him, and a gray beanie pulled down low over his ears. He stood slightly apart from the others, near the edge of the play structure, sketchpad in hand, pencil moving in quiet concentration even in the cold. Grace recognized the posture, the stillness, the same kind she used to carry. As the kids ran and slid and shouted, Grace turned to leave, when suddenly chaos erupted. A scream tore through the air, then shouting, then the unmistakable sound of nails on pavement. A large dog, black-furred, wild-eyed, had slipped its leash and bolted into the park. It wasn't vicious by nature, but panicked, untrained, and reactive. It charged toward the group of children, barking and snapping, foam at its mouth from the cold and stress. Most of the kids scattered, but Luke, startled, dropped his sketchpad and stumbled backward, catching his boot on a mound of snow and falling. He sat, frozen, his eyes locked on the incoming blur of muscle and teeth. Grace opened her mouth to yell, but Ember was already gone. The golden retriever didn't bark. She didn't hesitate. She moved like a switch had flipped inside her. Her injured leg trembled with each stride, but she pushed forward, faster than she had since recovery, cutting through the snow with purpose born of instinct. She threw herself between Luke and the oncoming dog. There was a collision fur, growling, paws clawing at the icy ground. Ember bared her teeth, not to attack, but to hold. She braced herself against the other dog, shielding Luke with her body. Her hind leg gave out and she dropped to one side, but she stayed between them, snarling once low, guttural, final. The other dog, startled by the resistance, faltered, backed off, then was quickly snatched by its breathless owner, a young man with wide eyes and a tangled leash. Grace had sprinted into the scene, heart pounding, grabbing Luke and pulling him upright. He clung to her arm, his breath visible in short, shaky clouds. She saved me," he whispered. Ember lay on her side, panting heavily, one paw bleeding where ice had sliced into her pad. But she wagged her tail weakly, once, as Grace knelt beside her. "You foolish, beautiful thing," Grace murmured, tears pressing hot behind her eyes. By the time the scene had settled, Luke's beanie had fallen, revealing a shock of hair damp with sweat. He knelt beside Ember, hands hovering just above her fur, not quite daring to touch her. "That's her," he said softly. "The one I saw, in my dreams, the guardian." Grace looked at him, stunned. "What do you mean?" Luke looked up at her, wide-eyed. "I've been drawing her, before I even saw her. The dog in the snow, watching a house. I didn't know it was real." Later that evening, in the warm yellow light of the flower shop, Grace sat across from May Taylor with a cup of chamomile tea. Ember rested at her feet, bandaged, exhausted, but alive. "She's been sketching her for weeks," May said, setting down her own cup. "The dog, the house, even you, I think. I didn't put it together, but he did." May was calm, composed, her voice low. Her long gray braid hung over one shoulder, and the light caught the gold locket at her throat. She looked over at Ember and smiled. "Maybe there's more to dreams than we think." Grace exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. "It's strange. I came back because I didn't know where else to go. I thought I was broken." "You were," May said simply. "But so was she, and sometimes broken things find each other." The next day, Luke's drawing his original sketch of the guardian under the moonlight was moved to the town hall bulletin board by the mayor's assistant. No one said officially why, but people gathered to look. Teachers came by. Parents paused after dropping off kids. No name was listed under the art, just a line in pencil, written small in the corner. She waited, and then she chose. The air in Redfield was crisper than usual, edged with the bite of late winter, though the snow was beginning to recede in soft patches under the midday sun. On the porch of the small wooden house at the edge of town, Grace Miller sat silently with Ember's head resting across her lap. The bandage on Ember's foreleg had been changed earlier that morning, and a new layer of gauze wrapped delicately around the pad she had torn during the scuffle in the park. Her breathing was steady, but her body sagged with exhaustion, the price of her bravery visible in every labored movement. Grace stroked her fur absent-mindedly, eyes vacant, lost between the ache of guilt and the weight of admiration. For hours after the incident, Grace had replayed it all in her mind. The moment Ember leapt without hesitation, the collision, the blood, Luke's trembling frame behind her. The image stuck in her like splinters. This dog, barely healed herself, had sacrificed everything once more. Not because she was told, but because she knew. The strength Grace no longer believed existed in herself had stared back at her through Ember's golden eyes. Inside the house, Grace's resignation letter still sat unsent in her desk drawer. Written weeks ago, it had become her quiet escape, a final step toward disappearing from the world that once asked too much of her. But now, something had shifted. Ember had shown her something she had forgotten, that broken things don't have to be useless. They can still protect, still give, still heal. Later that week, Grace walked into the Redfield Community Center, a modest brick building nestled between the post office and the public library. The receptionist, Ruth Devereaux, looked up from behind the counter with a kind smile. Ruth was in her mid-50s, plump and warm-eyed, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a low bun. She wore a knitted cardigan dotted with embroidered flowers and greeted everyone as if she'd known them since childhood. "Grace Miller," Ruth said, adjusting her glasses. "We've heard a lot about you and your golden girl these past few days." Grace gave a faint, tired smile. "Is this where I sign up? For the therapy dog program?" "Sure is," Ruth replied, handing over a clipboard. "We partner with a clinic in Bozeman for certification. Takes time, but from what I hear, your dog's already got the heart for it." Grace took the forms and sat quietly in the corner, Ember curled at her feet. Around the room, a few other people waited. An elderly man with a German Shepherd mix, a teenager with a small poodle in a red vest. The air felt lighter than Grace expected. No one here seemed interested in judgment, only healing. The decision to enroll wasn't impulsive. Grace had spent the past 2 nights watching Ember sleep, her breathing shallow but peaceful, and realized she didn't want their pain to be just something to survive. She wanted it to matter, to mean something. Therapy work wouldn't erase what had happened. Not the bank, not the months in the recovery ward, not the years of slow unraveling. But maybe it could make space for something new. Back at home, the training began in small steps. Ember had to relearn controlled walking, not just strength, but presence, moving calmly, following hand signals, maintaining focus in chaotic environments. Grace worked with her daily, using the same voice she once reserved for radio calls, calm, clear, purposeful. She set up obstacle courses in the living room, using chairs and cushions, played ambient hospital sounds to acclimate Ember to clinical noises, even brought in a friend from the force officer Nadia Chen, a fellow patrolwoman in her early 30s, short and compact, with a sharp jawline and quick wit, to simulate public interactions. Nadia, wearing jeans and a Redfield PD hoodie, watched as Ember calmly approached her, sat, and waited for a signal. "She's sharp," Nadia said, tossing a soft treat. "Calmer than most rookies I've trained." Grace chuckled, something she hadn't done in a long time. "She's braver than me." "No," Nadia replied. "She's brave because of you." Training Ember gave Grace new structure. Mornings were for focused drills, afternoons for exposure walks, parks, sidewalks, even the town diner where Ember learned to ignore fallen fries and patting hands. The more they worked, the more Grace noticed something subtle changing in herself. Her breathing deepened. Her thoughts no longer spiraled uncontrollably. She slept, not perfectly, but enough. And at night, she no longer reached for the pills on the shelf. Redfield had taken notice too. Children in the park began to greet Ember by name. The mayor's office reached out asking for a feature in the town newsletter. Even the local church requested a visit once Ember was certified. Grace felt herself re-entering a world she had once abandoned, not as a cop, not as a patient, but as someone beginning again. One morning, as Grace stood by the community bulletin board updating Ember's vaccination paperwork, a young woman approached her. She was tall, mid-20s, with long blonde hair braided over one shoulder and a baby carrier slung across her chest. She wore tired eyes but offered a warm, tentative smile. "Excuse me," she said, gesturing to Ember. "Is she the dog from the park, the one who protected that boy?" Grace nodded. "She is." The woman's eyes welled slightly. "I just wanted to say, thank you. My son goes to that school. He hasn't stopped talking about the Golden Protector. He draws her all the time." Grace bent down and rubbed Ember's neck. "She saved more than just one of us." As the woman walked off, Grace looked down at Ember, who blinked up at her with calm, amber eyes. The journey hadn't been easy. The wounds were still there. But for the first time in a long while, they were no longer the end of the story. They were just the beginning. The days that followed Ember's certification felt unlike anything Grace Miller had known in years, not the structured days of a police beat, nor the silent days of recovery. These were living days. Early mornings began with a harness, a checklist, and a warm thermos of coffee. Ember would sit by the door, vest already strapped, ears perked, and eyes shining with quiet purpose. The scar along her rear leg, faint but permanent, was a badge of its own, and it hadn't slowed her one bit. Their first official visit was to Ridgeview Nursing Home, a long, pale building nestled between spruce trees and a frozen pond that shimmered under the late winter sun. Grace had expected awkward greetings, perhaps even resistance, but what they received was something else entirely, stillness turning into warmth. Inside, Ember padded slowly down the halls, tail swaying like a metronome. In one room, she rested her head on the lap of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, an 87-year-old woman with paper-thin skin, silver curls, and deep laugh lines etched from a life of storytelling. Eleanor barely spoke anymore, according to staff. But when Ember leaned into her hand, the woman whispered, "You smell like sunlight," and smiled. In another room, James Porter, a grizzled former school teacher with dementia, had a sudden moment of lucidity. "You're the one from the paper," he said to Grace, blinking behind thick glasses. "The lady with the golden dog." "Yes, sir," Grace replied softly. "We're just visiting today." James nodded. "Good. The world needs more visits." From there, Ember's work grew. Though Grace never once called it work, it was presence, service. Every week, they rotated through spaces that held sorrow like a second skin: pediatric wards, rehabilitation centers, shelters. Ember never barked, never rushed. She simply was a silent force of kindness. It was during one of their hospital visits that Andrea Coles, a reporter with the Redfield Echo, spotted them. Andrea was in her early 30s, slender and sharp-eyed, with an auburn pixie cut and a camera always hanging from one shoulder. She had come to cover a community health initiative, but found herself lingering in the therapy wing after watching Ember lay beside a child undergoing chemotherapy. "Do you mind if I write about them?" she asked Grace afterward, already scribbling notes into a worn leather notebook. Grace hesitated. "I'm not doing this for attention," Andrea smiled. "Then let me give the attention to her." The article, titled "Golden Grace, A Story of Healing with 4 Paws," was published that Sunday. It featured a full-page photo of Ember in her vest, beside Grace in civilian clothes, both mid-step, walking toward the open doors of the community center. The piece didn't dramatize. It didn't sugarcoat. It simply chronicled their return, their shared strength. Soon after, Grace's mailbox overflowed. Letters from teachers, parents, elderly couples. One man wrote from 3 towns over, asking if Grace and Ember could visit his wife, who hadn't spoken since her stroke. Grace wrote back, "We're not miracle workers, but we can show up. Sometimes that's enough." At the heart of town, in a frame behind glass at the Redfield Library, was a copy of that Sunday edition, alongside a drawing. It was Luke's first picture of Ember, the golden dog beneath the moon, sitting before an open door. Someone, likely the librarian, had added a small brass label beneath it, drawn before they ever met. Luke, now less shy, had begun attending art classes on Saturdays. At the next town council meeting, he was presented with a small ribbon and the title, Youth Artist of the Year. The room applauded gently as he took the stage with his sketchpad in hand. He didn't say much, just held up the original drawing and whispered, "She found me." That same week, a quiet gesture unfolded outside the Redfield Police Department. Early one morning, before the sun had fully cleared the mountain ridge, May Taylor, in her long wool coat and green gloves, approached the building alone. In her hands, a small bouquet of forget-me-nots and rosemary wrapped in brown paper. She didn't go inside. She simply knelt by the sign, engraved with Redfield Police, honor, duty, service, and placed the bouquet at its base. Then, with a long breath, she stood and walked away. A young officer named Eli Robbins, tall with a square jaw and fresh academy nerves, had been inside when he saw her. He later asked Grace, "Did your mom drop off flowers at the station?" Grace blinked. "No, that wasn't my mom," he shrugged. "Well, she left them for someone." Grace didn't respond. But that night, she passed the station again and saw the bouquet still there, the petals bright even in the dim porch light. She knew who they were for, and she knew what they meant. That weekend, Grace found Ember watching her from the porch steps, tail brushing slowly against the wood. They had no appointments that day, no hospitals, no therapy, just them. Grace sat down beside her, ran a hand through her fur, and whispered, "You know, people think I saved you, but it's always been the other way around." Ember leaned into her side. The sun rose higher, and all the doors that had once been shut inside, Grace slowly, quietly, opened again. The invitation came on thick ivory paper, nestled in a navy envelope bearing the embossed seal of the National Therapy Animal Association. Grace stared at it for a long moment, her thumb tracing the lettering. The Guardian's Honor Ceremony, Washington, D.C., Guest of Honor, Ember, Therapy, Dog of the Year. It felt surreal, distant, like something that belonged to someone else's life. Yet Ember, lying calmly by the hearth with her head resting on her paws, thumped her tail once as if she knew. The flight to D.C. was Ember's first time on a plane, and she took to it with quiet dignity. Wearing her official therapy vest, she sat curled by Grace's feet, unfazed by the hum of the engines or the murmurs of fellow passengers. One flight attendant, a middle-aged man with silver-streaked hair and soft, fatherly eyes, paused as he passed and said, "She doesn't just calm people, she calms the air." The event was held in a grand old theater in the heart of D.C., all chandeliers, velvet seating, and warm gold light. Dozens of animals were being honored: service dogs, rescue animals, even a miniature horse who visited veterans in hospice. But the air seemed to shift when Grace and Ember took the stage. Cameras flashed. Applause rolled like gentle thunder. Grace stood at the podium, dressed simply in a dark suit, her hair pinned back, a silver pin in the shape of a paw print on her lapel. Ember sat at her side, her coat brushed to a warm sheen, her eyes calm and alert. Grace took a breath, steadying herself. "When I first met Ember," she began, her voice low but clear, "she was a puppy with more energy than sense. She chewed through every pair of socks I owned, barked at every bird, and had no idea what stay meant." Laughter rippled through the audience. "But later, after I came back from a call, I didn't think I'd survive when I couldn't sleep, when I couldn't talk, when I couldn't feel. She was the one who stayed." Grace paused. The silence in the room was gentle, listening. "She didn't ask me to be okay. She just laid there, warm and real. She reminded me that the world hadn't ended even when it felt like it had. Ember didn't just save my life. She saved all the pieces of me I thought I had lost." She looked down, her hand finding Ember's fur. "And now she shares that gift with others, children, elders, strangers. Because that's who she is. She's not just a therapy dog. She's a bridge back to the world." The crowd stood as one, the applause loud, rising. Grace didn't cry, but her hand trembled slightly as she bowed her head. Ember, ever still, simply leaned into her. Thousands of miles away, in the cozy living room above the flower shop in Redfield, Luke Taylor sat curled on the couch beside his grandmother. The television screen flickered gently in front of them, tuned to a national news station covering the event. May, wearing her wool cardigan and holding a steaming mug of tea, kept one arm around her grandson. When Grace appeared on the screen, Luke's eyes lit up. But it wasn't until Ember walked into frame that he whispered, "There she is." May looked down at him. "She looks strong, doesn't she?" Luke nodded slowly. "I knew her before I met her. In my dreams she always stood at the door. But now she's real. And she's making the world better." May pressed a kiss to his hair, her voice catching softly. "You dreamed her into the world, sweetheart. That's a powerful thing." After the ceremony, Grace and Ember returned to their hotel room briefly before the early evening flight. Grace stood by the window, watching the light over the Potomac soften to rose. Ember lay on the floor nearby, her head on her paws. Grace didn't speak, but she moved toward her, lowered herself to the carpet, and let their foreheads touch. "You've brought me farther than I thought I could go," she whispered. "But somehow, this doesn't feel like the end. It feels like we're just home." When they arrived back in Redfield later that week, the town welcomed them with quiet warmth. There was no parade, no press, just a small note slipped under Grace's door, written in careful cursive. "Thank you for bringing light into our dark corners." It wasn't signed. That evening, the sun dipped low behind the pines, casting long gold across the snow-softened yard. Grace sat on the porch steps, wrapped in her old flannel coat. Ember lay beside her, head resting against Grace's leg. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memories, of hope, of second chances. Inside the house, the fireplace crackled. A copy of the Redfield Echo sat folded neatly on the table. On its cover, Ember under stage lights, her eyes reflecting more than the room around her. The headline read, "One Dog, Two Lives Rebuilt." And as the light faded into twilight, Grace looked down at her companion, smiled, and whispered, "You were never just a dog. You were the part of me that knew how to come back." We don't choose where our story begins, but we can choose who walks beside us as it unfolds. Ember wasn't a miracle wrapped in perfection. She came with scars, silence, and the weight of a past no one asked for. Yet somehow, she became the light that warmed the coldest corners of a weary soul. She wasn't just a rescued dog. She was memory rekindled, a quiet guardian of forgotten hopes. Through Ember, a young boy found the courage to sleep without fear. An old woman rediscovered her voice, and a once broken officer learned to trust her own heart again. In our everyday lives, we might pass by an ember without even knowing it. A neighbor, a friend, or a furry companion waiting to offer quiet comfort. If this story moves something in you, share it. Let it echo. Leave a comment. Subscribe to walk this journey with us. And if your heart whispered yes to any part of this tale, take a moment to say a prayer for yourself, for those you love, and for every soul still waiting to be found. May God bless you.